Peter and Janet were having breakfast with their father and mother one lovely spring morning. Her father put down the paper and smiled. "Do the Secret Seven want to make themselves really useful?" he asked. "Because I've just read something in my paper that may be right up their street." "Oh, Dad, what?" cried Peter and Janet. "It's about a girl who's run away from home," said their father. "Listen, I'll read you the piece. Elizabeth Mary Wilhelmina Sonning, after being accused of stealing money from the desk of her form mistress, was found to be missing from her aunt's home. She's in school uniform and school hat. It is stated that her parents are abroad and that she has a brother who is at present away in France." Peter's father looked up from the paper. "Now comes the bit that might interest you," he said. "Elizabeth was seen on the evening of that day in Belling Village, and it is thought that she might be going to her grandmother, who lives not far off." "Belling Village? That's the next village to ours," said Janet. "There's a photograph of her," said her father. Peter and Janet stared at the picture in the paper. They thought she looked rather nice. "Though she can't be really, if she stole money and then ran away," thought Janet. "Whereabouts in Belling Village does her granny live?" "It doesn't say, does it?" said her father, reaching for his paper again. "You'll have to read this evening's paper and see if there are any more details. If the child goes to her granny's, she'll be found at once, of course. But if she hides somewhere around the place, you might be able to spot her." "Yes, we might," said Peter. "The Secret Seven haven't had anything interesting to do lately. We'll call a meeting tomorrow." That evening, Janet sat down to write notices to each of the Secret Seven to call them to a meeting the next day. Peter signed each one, and then he and Janet fetched their bicycles and rode off to deliver the notices. "We'd better buy an evening paper on our way back and see if there's anything else in it about Elizabeth Mary Wilhelmina Sonning," said Peter. On their way back, they stopped at the newsagent's and bought one. They found a small paragraph headed, "Missing Girl." Peter read aloud. "Elizabeth Sonning is still missing, and her grandmother states that she has not seen her. Anyone seeing a child whose appearance tallies with the following description is asked to get in touch with the police." Then there's a good description of her. "That's fine. We can read it out to the Seven tomorrow." Next morning, the Seven met in the shed in Peter and Janet's garden. "Anything exciting?" asked Jack eagerly. "Yes, there is," answered Peter. "But what about that awful sister of yours, Jack? Is she anywhere about? This is quite an important meeting." No, she's gone shopping with my mother," said Jack. "Susie doesn't even know there's a meeting on, so we're quite safe. She won't come snooping around." Peter cleared his throat. "Well now," he said, "it was my father who thought we should inquire into the matter I'm going to tell you about, so you can see it's quite important. It concerns a girl who's run away from her aunt's home after stealing some money at school. She's been seen near here at Belling Village, where her grandmother lives, but so far hasn't been to see her granny." "Oh, and I suppose it's up to the Secret Seven to keep a lookout for her and find her," said Jack. "Oh, we ought to be able to do that, all right. What's she like? And what are your plans, Peter?" Peter explained everything clearly. "The girl's name is Elizabeth Mary Wilhelmina Sonning," he said. "Her parents live abroad, and she is a weekly boarder at school and spends her weekends with an aunt. She has a brother who is away in France. She was accused of stealing money from her form mistress's desk, and when the police went to speak to her aunt about it, she ran away. Here's her photograph. Ordinary navy school coat, navy felt hat with school band round it, ordinary shoes and stockings. It says here that she wore a gym tunic underneath with a white blouse." "Where's the description of what she's like?" asked Janet. "It was in the evening paper last night, Peter." "Oh, yes, here it is," said Peter, and began to read out loud. "Elizabeth can be recognized by her dark curly hair, her brown eyes, straight eyebrows, and a scar down one arm. She's tall for her age and strong. She swims well and is fond of horses." "Well, do you think you'd spot her if you saw her?" "We might," said Colin doubtfully. "But lots of girls have got dark hair and brown eyes. We might spot the scar, but that's the one thing she will certainly hide." "How do we set about looking for her?" asked George. "That's what we've got to discuss," said Peter. "Elizabeth will be sure to find a hiding place. She'll lie low. Where would you hide if you ran away from home?" "In a barn," said Pam. "In the woods under a thick bush," said George. "I thought it would be sensible if we thoroughly explored Belling Village and round about," said Peter. "She must be hiding somewhere near. I expect the police have already hunted pretty well everywhere, but we know better where to look because we know where we'd hide if we wanted to." "What about the grandmother, Peter? Should one of us go to see her, do you think?" said George. "Yes, I think that's a good idea," said Peter, considering it. "Jack and I will go, probably, And listen, there's another thing we might do. What? Asked everyone. Well, this girl is fond of horses, it seems. We might go to the 2 or 3 stables we know of and see if any girl's been seen hanging around. She might even try to get a job at one. That's a good idea, said Janet. Well, there seems to be quite a lot of things we can do. The next thing is to give each one of us a section of the countryside to hunt, said Colin. It's no good us all going together. What particular places must we search, Peter? Well, said Peter, anywhere that looks likely. A deserted shack, an empty caravan, a copse, anywhere in the woods where there are thick bushes, barns, sheds, or even a hen house. Now, Secret 7, there are 2 hours before dinner. Arrange between yourselves where you're going to search. Jack and I are going off to the grandmother's house. Everyone report back at 2:30 sharp. Now, get going. Peter and Jack went out of the shed together. Do you know the address of the grandmother's? Asked Jack. No, said Peter. But her name is Sonning, so let's look in the phone book. The 2 boys went down the path to the back door, and Peter looked for the telephone book. What are you looking for, dear? Asked his mother. I was looking for the phone number of that girl's grandmother, said Peter. I was going to call there with Jack, but I don't know her address. She often runs jumble sales for Belling Women's Institute, and she wrote and asked me for some old clothes, said his mother. Oh, what a chance for us! Can we take some over to her and say it's from you? And maybe she'll tell us about Elizabeth. Very well, I'll give you some jumble, and you can say I sent it by you. But if she doesn't want to say a word about Elizabeth, you're not to ask questions. All right, we'll be quite polite, really, said Peter. Where's the jumble? In those 2 boxes, said his mother. The address is Bramble Cottage, Blackberry Lane. The 2 boys hurried off. Wasn't that a bit of luck, said Peter. Come on. They rode off and soon came to Blackberry Lane. Bramble Cottage was the last house in the lane. They carried the 2 cardboard boxes up the path and rang the bell. They heard footsteps coming, and then someone in an overall opened the door and looked inquiringly at them. She looked a good deal too young to be a grandmother. We've brought some jumble for Mrs. Sonning's sale, he said. May we speak to her, please? Come in, said the woman. You can't see Mrs. Sonning. She's not very well. I'm Miss Wardle, her companion. I suppose she's upset about her granddaughter, said Peter, plunging in at once. Ah, yes, said Miss Wardle. She's so fond of Elizabeth. She doesn't believe all that nonsense about stealing money. Neither do I. Do you know Elizabeth, then? Asked Peter. I've known her since she was so-I, said Miss Wardle. And a nicer, more honest, straightforward child I've never seen. You think she's somewhere about here? Asked Jack. Yes, and what's more, it's my belief she's been here to this very house, said Miss Wardle, lowering her voice. I haven't told Mrs. Sonning about it, but some of my tarts went last night, and a meat pie, and a tin of biscuits, and a rug off the back room sofa. This was news indeed. Peter looked at Jack. Why do you suppose she won't come to her grandmother? Asked Peter. People usually hide when they feel guilty, but you say you don't believe Elizabeth is guilty of stealing that money. That's true, I don't, said Miss Wardle. But the money was found in her chest of drawers. Who's that, Emma? Who's that? A voice suddenly called from upstairs. Is there any news of Elizabeth? That's Mrs. Sonning. You must go, said Miss Wardle, and ran up the stairs at once. Come on, said Peter to Jack. We've got quite a lot of information. Now, how had the others been getting on? Pam and Barbara had planned to explore the woods and the fields on the east side of Belling. As they cycled along, Pam said, Look, there's an empty caravan. See, in that field there. That would be a good place for anyone to hide in. Pam stood on guard near the dirty, broken-down old van, which looked as if no one had lived in it for years. Barbara went cautiously up the steps and looked inside. She beckoned to Pam in excitement. Pam, someone does live here. There are a couple of old dirty rugs or blankets and a tin mug and plate. Do come and look. Pam came up the steps too. Phew, she said, and held her nose. What a frightful smell. Oh, come down, Barbara. You know jolly well you'd never hide in a place like that, nor any other schoolgirl either. You're right. I'd rather sleep in a ditch than in there, said Barbara. Come on, let's get on with our job. We want to have plenty to report to the others this afternoon. What about the woods? Asked Pam at last. So they went to the nearby woods, looking behind any thick bush. But there was nothing at all interesting or exciting to be seen. Pam found an empty cigarette packet, and Barbara found a dirty handkerchief with J.P. on it, but neither of them felt that they were of any value in the hunt. And then Pam suddenly clutched hold of Barbara, making her jump violently, and hissed in her ear, "Quiet! Somebody's coming! And it's a girl! Look!" They crept under a thick bush at once. Yes, it was a schoolgirl in navy blue coming down a path towards their bush. "Keep still, and then we'll follow her," whispered Pam. "I bet that's the girl we want." The girl's hat was pulled well down over her eyes. She walked boldly up to the bush, and then suddenly fell into it, almost squashing Pam and Barbara. She began to roar with laughter. "Oh, it's Susie! Jack's horrible sister Susie!" cried Barbara indignantly. "Get off us, Susie! You've nearly squashed us flat! What did you do that for?" "Well, you were lying in wait to jump out at me, weren't you?" asked Susie. "I spotted you crawling into the bush." "We were not lying in wait for you," said Pam. "Well," said Susie, "what were you doing then? Come on, you've got to tell me." "Certainly not," said Pam indignantly. "We keep our secrets to ourselves." "Well, I'll get it out of Jack," said the irritating Susie, and walked off, tipping her hat over her face once more. "Goodbye, and don't lie in wait for me again." "Now she knows we're in the middle of another excitement," said Barbara, brushing herself down. "She's so sharp that I'm sure she'll find out what it is. Let's go home. We've nothing to report except about Susie, but at least we've done our best." George and Janet had looked up the riding stables in the district and found that there were 3. "Belling riding stables," said Janet, "and Warner's riding stables, and Tiptree's. We'll go to all 3, shall we?" So off they went on their bicycles to Tiptree's stables first. Janet knew the man who ran it, for he was a friend of her father's. "Do you ever let schoolgirls work here, perhaps in the school holidays, Mr. Tiptree?" asked Janet. The riding master laughed. No, I get plenty of help from my wife and 2 daughters. They're all mad about horses." "Come on, Janet," said George, seeing that they could get no useful information from Mr. Tiptree. Obviously the runaway girl would not be able to get a job here, even if she wanted one. They rode off again. "We'll go to Warner's stables next," said George. "That's not far from the old granny's house. It might be a good place for Elizabeth Sonning to hide in, or get a job at." "I hardly think she'd go anywhere so close, would she?" said Janet. "She might be recognized." Warner's stables were quite big and looked busy as they came up to them. "Let's have a snoop around," said Janet. "Wouldn't Elizabeth have to wear riding things if she wanted a job at a stable?" said George. "We know that she was wearing her school clothes when she left. She took no others." "Look, there are 2 stable boys over there. Let's go and talk to them," said Janet. George and Janet made their way to the 2 stable boys. One was helping a small girl down from a pony. "Hello, Janet," said the small girl, and Janet turned in surprise. It was Hilda, a girl who went to her school. "Hello," said Janet, pleased to see her. Now she could pretend that she was with her, and it wouldn't matter that she and George were close. Everyone would think that they'd come to meet Hilda. "Thank you, Tom," said Hilda to the boy who'd helped her down. "You talk to this boy, and I'll talk to the other one," said George in a low voice to Janet. "Right," said Janet, and went to Tom and Hilda. She asked him, "Are there any other stable boys?" "No," said the boy, "just us 2. He began to clean out the stall next to the little pony. Janet thought he was rather rude. "He's like that," said Hilda to Janet. "The other boy, Harry, doesn't mind telling you anything. He's talking to George as if he's known him for years." And so he was. "Do they have many stable girls here?" George asked when he had a good chance. The burly fellow shook his head. "One came the other day to ask for a job, but Mr. Warner turned her down at once. Why, she wasn't any bigger than you." George pricked up his ears. Could it have been Elizabeth? Was she brown-eyed?" asked George eagerly. "Had she dark, fluffy hair, and did you notice if she had a scar down one of her arms?" "I didn't see her," said Tom, much to Janet's and George's disappointment. "I wasn't here the day she came." "Oh, no, that's right," said Harry. "Well, I know she hadn't got dark hair." "I saw a girl like the one you described when I was in Galton the other day," said Tom suddenly. "Fluffy brown hair, you said, didn't you, and a scar down one arm?" "Did you?" cried Janet, looking thrilled. "How did you manage to see her scar?" Well, she sat in a tea shop, and it was hot there, so she took off her coat," said Tom. "I saw her scar then." "Could you tell us anything she said?" asked George. She said she was going to catch a train to London and fly to France to join a brother of hers," said Tom. Why, the girl must have been Elizabeth then. A scar on her arm, and a brother in France. There was no doubt about it. Tom went off, and Janet and George made their way back to tell their news to the others. Everyone was early for the 2:30 meeting. "I hope everyone has something to report," said Peter. "Jack and I went to the grandmother's house, but the old lady wasn't well, so we asked her companion about the girl. We learnt that Elizabeth is definitely hiding somewhere in the district, not far from her granny's, because she's got into the house at night and taken pies and things." "But Peter," began George and Janet together. Peter frowned. "Please don't interrupt," he said. "You can have your say in a minute. Jack and I are going to take some more jumble to the grandmother's on Monday, and if Elizabeth has been getting into the house again, we could perhaps watch that night and see if we can catch her." "Good idea," said Pam, Barbara and Colin. George and Janet said nothing, but looked meaningly at one another. "What about you, Colin?" asked Peter. "Nothing to report at all," said Colin in a rather apologetic tone. "I examined all kinds of barns, but didn't find out a thing." "That's all right," said Peter. "Barbara and Pam, what's your report?" "Nothing much either," said Barbara. "We found a smelly old caravan, and we hunted through thorny copse wood." "And that awful sister of Jack's was there too," said Pam. "We saw her coming along, dressed in the same uniform as we were, and we thought it might be the runaway girl, so we hid in a bush, and Susie jumped right into it on purpose." "So that's why Susie was pestering me," said Jack. "You're a couple of idiots to make her think there's something up, you two." "I wouldn't be a bit surprised if she's not snooping outside somewhere now," said Peter. At that very moment, a face looked in at the window of the shed. It was Susie, of course. "Hello, Secret Seven," she called. "I know what you're all up to. I found your newspaper cutting. Jack leapt up in a fury and raced out. Susie was a fast runner. She was running out of the gate, laughing before Jack was halfway there. He went back to the shed, red in the face. "Now Susie will be hunting too. Blow! If she finds Elizabeth before we do, I shall be jolly furious," said Peter. "She won't," said George. "Wait till you hear what Janet and I have to report. We saw two stable boys, one called Harry and the other called Tom. He was a bit surly, we thought, but Harry wasn't. The other boy, Tom, suddenly said that he'd seen a girl like the one we were describing, and she even had a scar down one arm." "This is news," said Peter, delighted. "Go on, George. Where'd he seen Elizabeth?" "He said he met her in a tea shop not very far from here. She had her coat off. That's how he noticed the scar down one arm. She talked to him and told him she was going to London to get a plane to France to see her brother," said Janet. "So it must have been Elizabeth, mustn't it?" "Now you see why Janet and I don't think that Elizabeth's hiding anywhere in the district," said George. "Well," said Peter, "if Elizabeth is in London, waiting to fly to France, who is it who's taking pies from her grandmother's house at night?" There was a deep silence. "I hadn't thought of that," said Janet. "One of our reports is wrong somehow. If Elizabeth is hanging around her granny's house at night, she can't be going to fly to France. She might have changed her mind and gone to Berlin after all. She might even have hoped to get money from her grandmother's house. If she had stolen once, she could easily do so again," said Jack. There was another silence. The seven were trying to sort things out in their minds. Peter made up his mind that the next thing to do was to go and interview the two stable boys himself. They might be able to tell him something that they hadn't thought of telling Janet or George. They would all meet again on Monday. 5 o'clock sharp, said Peter, and don't be late. On Monday at 5 o'clock, all the seven were in the shed. Good, said Peter, pleased. Well, Jack and I will bike to Bramble Cottage and see if we can get any more news out of the companion or Mrs. Sonning, the granny. The rest of you can bike up to Warner's stables and wait for us there. They all set off, Peter with a neat box of jumble tied to the back of his bicycle. Peter and Jack left their bicycles at the gate of Bramble Cottage and went to the front door. The companion opened the door. Well now, don't say you've been kind enough to bring us some more jumble, she said. Mrs. Sonning was so pleased with the boxes you brought on Saturday. I'll give her these. She's still in bed, dear old lady. Oh, I'm sorry, said Peter. Hasn't she heard any more of her granddaughter? Not a word, said Miss Wardle. The police say she seems to have disappeared completely, and yet she came here again last night. Did you see her? Did she leave a note? Asked Peter. No, not a sign that she was here, except that more food was gone. How she got in beats me. Every door and window I made fast, myself. She must have got a key to the side door. That's the only one with no bolt. What did the police say about that? Asked Jack. Nothing, said Miss Wardle, rather indignantly. Why don't they put a man to watch the house at night? They'd catch the poor child then, and what a relief it would be. Why don't you watch, Miss Wardle? Asked Peter. What? Watch every door and window, said the companion. Nobody could do that. We'd better go, said Peter. I hope Elizabeth is found soon. Goodbye. Well, said Peter as they went out of the front gate, we'll have to hide somewhere in the garden here tonight and see if we can spot Elizabeth. Let's go and find the others. Mr. Warner said we could take the ponies down to the field later on with Tom, the stable boy, said Janet. Good. We'll come too, said Peter. Tom nodded. Peter looked at him keenly. So this was the boy who actually saw Elizabeth. I say, I hear you saw that girl, Elizabeth Sonning, the other day, began Peter. That's jolly interesting. The police haven't found her yet. I reckon she's in France by now. She said she wanted to go to her brother, Tom interrupted. Well, she's not in France, said Peter. She goes each night to her granny's house and takes things. Miss Wardle told me that. Jack joined in then, and we thought we'd go and watch the house ourselves tonight, he said. We're sure we should see her getting in if she comes in the dark. Are you really going to watch tonight? Said Tom, sounding surprised. Peter nodded. He hadn't wanted Jack to tell a Secret Seven plan to the stable boy. Well, I'd like to come too, said Tom, most surprisingly. I bet I could see anyone creeping into a house at night. Peter hesitated. He wanted to say that Tom could certainly not come, but how could he prevent him if he wanted to? All right, he said at last. We shall be there at 10:30, just the 4 boys. I'll be there, said Tom, and I suppose a policeman or two will as well. Well, you stick up for me if I get seen by the police, and say I'm a friend of yours, not a burglar. All right, said Peter, wishing more than ever that Jack hadn't said so much. After they'd safely fastened in their tired ponies, the 7 with Tom walked back to the stables. Tom looked tired and spoke very little. The children said goodbye and fetched their bicycles. In the distance they saw someone with a suitcase, someone in a navy blue coat and hat, someone who looked round and then, seeming scared, ran hurriedly down the road. Look, said Colin, pointing. Is that Elizabeth with a suitcase? Joe, quick, let's follow! They rode speedily along the path until they came to the road. Janet picked up something white. A handkerchief, she said. And look! It's got E in the corner. It was Elizabeth. Quick, let's follow. There she is, at the corner, by that old cottage, shouted George. The whole 7 cycled as fast as they could. The figure reached the corner and vanished round it. The 7 dismounted from their bicycles and looked at one another. Wherever has she gone? Said Janet. There's that ruined old cottage, said Colin, pointing. I bet she's there. Putting their bicycles beside the hedge, they ran over to the old cottage. There's nobody here, said Pam, surprised. George gave a shout. The girl isn't here, but her suitcase is, and it's got EMWS on it. Her initials. They looked at the little suitcase on the dirty floor. It had EMWS printed on it in black. Elizabeth, where are you? Called Barbara. There was no reply. That's queer, said Janet. Why did she throw her suitcase up these stairs and then rush away? She might guess we'd find it. I'm going to open the case, said Peter. The 7 crowded round to look inside. One small box was there, and nothing else. It was tied up with string and had the money printed on it. Peter undid the string and opened the box. Inside was a smaller one, and inside that, another. He looked puzzled. He opened the 3rd box, and inside that was a card. Peter stared at it as if he couldn't believe his eyes. What does it say? Cried Pam, trying to see. What does it say? Peter flung it down on the floor and stamped on it, looking very angry. It says, lots and lots of love from Susie. The Secret 7 were very, very angry, especially Jack. Just wait till I get home. I'll have something to say to her, he said. They left the little ruined cottage and rode away. Peter began to arrange the night's meeting with George, Jack, and Colin. Don't you dare to let anything out to Susie about tonight, Peter warned Jack. If you do, I'll dismiss you from the Secret Seven." That night, Peter, Jack, George and Colin met together and then cycled quickly over to the grandmother's house in Belling. The cottage was in complete darkness. "Two at the back, one in front, you, Colin, and one at the side where the side door is," said Peter in a low voice. "There are no bolts there on the inside." "Oh, yes," said Jack. "I'll go and hide in the hedge beside the garden door. We shall be watching every door there is, and every window." "There's no moon. We shall have to keep our ears wide open," said Peter. A slight noise came from nearby, and then a shadow loomed up. A voice spoke. "It's me, Tom. I was waiting here, and I heard you. Where are you hiding?" They told him. "I don't think any policemen are about. I've been here for some time. I'll find a tree to climb. That one over there, near the wall. I shall have a good view from there." The four went to find their own hiding places. They heard Tom climbing his tree. Then there was silence. Nothing happened for a while. They all listened hard and tried to see through the darkness. Then someone brushed by Peter's bush, and he crouched back in fright. He heard a man cough. It must be a policeman. Now at least one policeman was in the garden. Peter's heart began to thump. Suddenly he stared in amazement. Was that a light he saw in one of the upstairs rooms of the house? A light like that made by a torch. He could see the beam moving here and there behind the drawn curtains. Elizabeth must be there. She must have got in somehow, in spite of everyone watching. Or could it be Miss Wardle creeping about with a torch? No, surely she would switch the light on. The light in the upstairs room disappeared, and reappeared again in another room. Peter thought it was the kitchen. Perhaps the hungry runaway girl was looking for food again. The light from the torch inside the house moved here and there, then it disappeared completely. All the watchers listened and strained their eyes in the darkness. Nothing happened. For 10 whole minutes, the watchers stood silent and tense. Then a man's voice called, "Seen anyone?" Another man's voice answered, "No, not a thing. The kid must be still in the house. We'll wake Miss Wardle and search." So there were 2 policemen in the garden then. The others left their hiding places and came cautiously to find Peter. Tom slid down the tree and joined them too. "Did you see anything else, Tom?" Peter asked him. "Not a thing," said Tom. "Look, I'll slip off, I think. The police don't know me, and they might wonder what I'm doing here with you. So long." He disappeared into the night, and the 4 boys went near the front door. The door was being opened cautiously by a very scared Miss Wardle. The boys heard her say to the police, "Come in. I'm afraid I was asleep. Do you want me to go and see if anything is taken?" "Well, Miss Wardle," said one of the policemen, "we saw the light of a torch in 2 rooms. One of us would like to come in and search. The other will stay out here in case the girl, if it is the girl, tries to make a run for it." The policeman disappeared into the cottage with Miss Wardle, leaving the other man on guard in the garden. The 4 boys watched from the safety of the shadows. After what seemed like a very long time, they heard voices. "Nothing to report, Will," said the policeman to the man on guard. "Nobody's in the house. Miss Wardle even went into the old lady's room to make sure the girl hadn't crept in there." "Well, nobody's come out of the house," said Will. "Has anything been taken?" "Yeah, more food. Nothing else," said the first policeman. "Queer, isn't it? How could anyone have got in under our very eyes and ears?" "Well, our brother's coming over to this country tomorrow. Not that he can do much if we can't." The police departed. The front door shut. "What do you make of it, Peter?" whispered Jack. "I can't understand it," said Peter. "I mean, there were us 4 and 2 policemen and Tom, and yet not one of us saw Elizabeth." "And yet she must have come in here into this garden," said Jack. "Come on, let's go home and sleep on it," said Peter. The 4 boys belonging to the Secret Seven overslept the next morning. Their next meeting was not very thrilling. After such high hopes of something really exciting happening the night before, everyone felt flat. "The policeman hunted all through the cottage last night without finding Elizabeth. It's a small place, no cellars, no attics. We did hear one thing, though. The brother who's in France is arriving in this country today." "Well, why don't you go and see him?" said Pam. "You could tell him what you know, about Tom, for instance." Suddenly there was an unexpected knock at the shed door. "What's that?" said Peter. If it's Susie, I'll have a few sharp words to say to her about playing that trick on us with the suitcase. It was Susie. She stood, grinning at the door when Peter opened it. "Let me in. I know where Elizabeth is and what she's doing. You do not!" yelled a furious Peter. "Jack, pull her by the hair all the way home. Pam, Barbara, Janet, get hold of her frock and pull too. Come on!" And, for once, Susie was taken by surprise and found herself being dragged to the gate. And not very gently either. "All right," she yelled, kicking and hitting out as vigorously as she could. "I shan't tell you my clues." She disappeared up the lane, and the 7 went back to the shed, feeling better for the excitement. "How does Susie know anything? Have you been talking or something, Jack?" asked Peter. "No," said Jack, still angry. "Blow, Susie! You don't think she really does know something, do you?" "How can she?" said Peter. "Anyway, our plans now are what matter. Jack and I will go and see Elizabeth's brother if he's arrived at the grandmother's. He'll be sure to go there. Come on, Jack. I'm fed up with this meeting. Let's go." Peter and Jack arrived at Bramble Cottage on their bicycles. 3 people were sitting in the little garden. One was Miss Wardle, one was an old lady, obviously the grandmother, and one was a youth of about 18, looking very worried. Miss Wardle recognized them at once. "Oh," she said to the old lady beside her, "those are the 2 nice boys who brought all that jumble." Peter and Jack walked over. "Good evening," said Peter. "I do hope you have news of your granddaughter, Mrs. Sonning." "No, we haven't," said the old lady. "This is my grandson, Charles, her brother. He's come over from France to see if he can help." "We met a boy the other day who saw her near here," said Peter. "What?" said the boy Charles. "Someone actually saw her? Who was this boy?" "One of the stable boys at Warner's stables," said Peter. "He said Elizabeth told him she was going to France to see you." "But she didn't know where I was in France," said Charles. "Even the police only got in touch with me with great difficulty." "Well," said Peter, "that's what Tom said she told him." "I'll go and see him," said Charles, and got up. But just then the telephone bell rang. "Answer it, Charles, there's a dear," said old Mrs. Sonning, and the boy went indoors. Peter and Jack were immensely surprised to see him come running out again at top speed. "Granny, it was Elizabeth's headmistress. All that upset about the stolen money's cleared up," said Charles. "It wasn't Elizabeth who took it, of course. The girl who stole it got frightened when the papers kept reporting that Elizabeth hasn't been found, and she suddenly owned up. I expect she thought she might have to go to prison or something." "Poor child. But now she can come back with her name cleared," said Mrs. Sonning. "Yes, but are we going to let her know that everything's all right?" asked Miss Wardle. "We don't even know where the child is." "Well, the first thing to do is for me to go up and see this stable boy who met Elizabeth," said Charles, getting up. "Will you take me up to him, you 2 boys?" "Yes," said Peter and Jack, who had been listening to the conversation with much interest. "We'll take you now. I say, we're glad everything's cleared up." Peter, Jack, and Charles went up the hill to Warner's stables. They liked Charles. He reminded them of someone, but they couldn't think who it was. "Where's Tom?" Peter called to Harry when they came to the stables. He was saddling a horse. "Somewhere about," he shouted back. "Over there, I think." Charles went with Jack, and Peter looked into the stables. At the far end he saw Tom, cleaning out one of the stalls. "Hey, Tom," called Peter. "There's someone wants to see you." "Who?" shouted back Tom. "You remember meeting that girl Elizabeth?" said Peter. "Well, it's her brother, Charles. He's come over from France. He's so upset and—" He stopped. Tom suddenly flung down his rake and shot past him at top speed. He tore out of the door, and Peter stared in surprise. Peter called to Jack and Charles. "Did you see Tom? He tore out of here just now. Goodness knows why." "We saw someone racing off," said Jack. Harry, the other stable boy, came up. "Don't take any notice of Tom," he said. "He's a bit odd." "But where did he go?" said Peter. "Do you know where he lives?" Since Harry didn't know where Tom lived, Jack and Peter gave it up. "Sorry," they said to Charles, and Peter added, "We could come here again tomorrow if you like. Not that Tom can really tell you anything of importance. He may even have made it all up about meeting Elizabeth. He may have read about her in the papers and just invented the whole meeting. He really is a bit strange, I think." "Well, thank you," said Charles, who looked worried again. "I'll go back." The boys rode off down the hill. "We'll have another Secret 7 meeting tomorrow night to report this evening's happenings," said Peter. The next evening, the 7 took their bicycles and went riding to Warner's stables once more, leaving a message at Bramble Cottage for Charles to follow. Harry was carting straw about the yard, but Tom was nowhere to be seen.
He asked if he could work down in the fields today, said Harry. Not in the stables. He's a bit touchy today, is old Tom. If someone called Charles comes along, tell him where we are, said Peter. They rode down to the fields and saw Tom in the distance. They shouted to him. He stopped and looked hard at them all. Then he came cantering over. Sorry, I'm busy, he said. Is there anything you want? Yes, said Peter. I want to ask you a question. Do you know where Elizabeth Sonning is hiding? A frightened look came into Tom's face. Why should I know that, he said. Don't be crazy. And with that he galloped off. He does know, he does, said Jack. And he won't tell. He turned to Peter and looked suddenly astonished. Why? Peter, what on earth's the matter? Why are you looking like that? Peter did indeed look queer, astonished, bewildered, as if someone had knocked him on the head. Peter, what is it? Gosh, of course he knows where Elizabeth is, said Peter. Nobody in the world knows better where Elizabeth hides out. They all thought Peter had gone mad. What in the world did he mean? Then Peter did something very surprising. He lifted his bicycle over the gate into the field, mounted it, and rode over the grass after Tom, who was still cantering along on the pony. The seven stared open-mouthed. Peter had gone off his head. Now he was shouting at the top of his voice. Come here, you fathead! Everything's all right, Elizabeth! Mad, said Jack. They all stood and watched, really amazed. Now Peter was cycling quite near to Tom and was still shouting. Everything's all right, I tell you. A girl's confessed she took the money. Everyone knows it wasn't you. Peter was out of breath, but he still talked. You're Elizabeth. I know you are. I knew your brother reminded me of someone. You are Elizabeth, aren't you? Tears began to fall down the girl's face. Yes, I am Elizabeth Sonning. Oh, is it true? Nobody will think me a thief anymore? Nobody, said Peter. My word, you're a plucky kid, aren't you? Getting a job as a stable boy? Where did you hide at night? Elizabeth looked straight past him. Oh, there's Charles, she said. The two hugged one another tightly. The seven went over to them. What a surprising ending to the problem they'd been puzzling over for so long. Well, you monkey, said Charles. What have you got to say for yourself, bringing me over from France like this? Having everyone hunting for you. Where have you been hiding? Oh, Charles, I'll answer all your questions, said Elizabeth. But let's go to Granny's. I do want to tell her everything's all right. Come on, then, said Charles, putting his arm around his sister. He turned to the seven. You kids can come too, he said. We've a lot to thank you for. They all went out of the field and took the path that led down to Bramble Cottage. The seven were very thrilled to be in at the finish. Miss Wardle went indoors and brought out biscuits and lemonade for everyone. You poor child, said Mrs. Sonning. Bless you. I knew you weren't the thief. Why did you tell us that you had met yourself and all that? Asked Peter, puzzled. Only to put you off the scent, said Elizabeth. I thought if people imagined I was off to France to find Charles, they wouldn't guess I was hiding near Granny's. How did you get into the house, Elizabeth? And Peter added, You were Tom up that tree. Elizabeth laughed. Yes, of course. That tree was a branch that goes to the bathroom window, and I know how to open the window from the outside and slip in. I took some food, a rug, and Charles's old riding clothes. But what I want to know is, how did you, Peter, realize so suddenly that Tom the stable boy was Elizabeth? Asked Charles. Well, I suddenly saw the likeness between you, said Peter. And then, somehow, the bits of the jigsaw all fell into place, if you know what I mean. Everyone laughed. Elizabeth looked so happy to be back with her family again, and the Secret Seven, pleased to have solved their mystery, rode away on their bicycles.